how do we know a kid's transgender, Gabe?
The most reliable method, I would say, is through psychological assessment.
Right. And what is exactly that? Do you know?
I'm not an expert in this. There are like tests and measurement in the psychological literature, and usually like a clinical interview.
Is there
So
a biological test? Like,
there
can you
not
pee in a
not that
vial?
I know. No.
No. So how do we know if a kid's transgender? Because the kid tells them.
Okay.
These doctors and therapists put me through this. They had no reason to, except for the fact that I said it.
But what's
Is that a
with
reliable method?
that?
Is self-reporting a good, reliable method?
I would argue that this would be reliable based off of the results said by kids who report these things and how their transition goes after the fact.
When kids are going through puberty, they're often confused and crazy. Would you agree?
Sure.
Yeah.
I work in behavioral health. So I work in a school working with kids with extreme emotional disturbances. And we have seen a trend post-pandemic of a lot of kids in these facilities identifying as transgender.
There you go.
Yes. So I'm very sympathetic to, I'm not saying that there's no problems with that big study that came out that a lot of psychologists like hated about how social pressures like in school, socialization can cause people to identify as transgender who might not be. That study, someone in the chat probably knows exactly what I'm talking about, got a lot of criticism, but I think there might be some merit to that based off at least the anecdotal.
Like, so many of my friends are starting to identify as transgender and are starting to transition, and it feels like something that is really, it's catching fire.
But I heard somewhere that the majority of young kids, like teenagers that transition to trans, don't regret it. It's only a few percentage that regret it afterwards.
That would be correct, yes.
Okay. What percentage? Do we know?
I'm not sure. I heard it somewhere on YouTube.
Is this based on polling data, or is this just based on what you've heard on social media?
No, there's psychological studies done on it. Gender dysphoria is a pretty fixed, common thing, and we know that what seems to help.
How fixed is it? Do you have any data?
Again, it's fixed enough for, like I said, it's fixed enough based off of the amount of people that we see who report better quality of life after transition.
The studies that we do have show that, depending upon study, somewhere between roughly 65 and 98% of children who have gender dysphoria as kids will not have clinically significant gender dysphoria as adults.
Okay, let me ask you, what percentage of kids who identify as transgender, in your own professional opinion, and I know it's a guess because you haven't surveyed all of them, but what?
Yeah, and I'm definitely not an expert on
but
it.
I'm asking you to guess, an educated guess, because you work in this field. What percentage of kids who identify as transgender do you think will go back to saying they're not transgender?
So we have some kids, I don't know how to say this. There's some kids that seem quite obvious that they're pretty clearly transgender. They've identified that way for a very, very, very long time. And then there's other kids who do not have that history.
I know. I'm just asking, is it over 50%, under 50% who?
I think maybe as high as 50-50.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we were talking about the 99-1, now we're talking 50-50.
Okay. Can I ask you this? Can you see a distinction between people identifying as transgender versus people diagnosed with gender dysphoria?
No. And here's why.
Why not?
Because the way you're diagnosed is from the kids who say, I'm transgender. Would you be for or against a psychologist making an assessment after one meeting with a teenager?
Absolutely, I'd be against that.
2. How about 2 meetings?
I would still lean very heavily against
3. How about 3 meetings?
I would say it probably closer to about 8 meetings or so at the very least.
Okay. See, we can forget about all this talk about our disagreements. This is where the rubber hits the road. And I
I get the concern.
yeah, and I have a sense that I could, if I wanted to, find places in the United States where kids have been treated with less than 8 visits from a psychologist.
I'd love for you to try to find that.
Now just know, like, how truly easy it is for you to go and get treatment if you live in an area with informed consent treatment. I literally made an appointment with a doctor's office in Chicago. I live in Indiana. So I drove up to Chicago. I went to a doctor's appointment that I had set up for 2 weeks prior. Like, it was very quick. And then that day I received estrogen.
I don't think that many people know that young people can walk into a Planned Parenthood in many different states and just walk out with hormones. But the Planned Parenthoods are operating on what's called an informed consent model. And if they sign a piece of paper saying that they acknowledge the risks, then they can be given these powerful hormones with irreversible side effects.
I saw one of those therapists for probably about an hour, and he wrote a letter recommending testosterone for me.
The therapist said I'm automatically transgender, and she does not want to gatekeep me on anything. And she had my letter to transition right away after my first session with her.
My parents took me to a gender therapist, and what I think they thought would happen is that this person would work with me on my gender issues, maybe get to the root cause, and maybe I would end up being trans, maybe not. But what happened is they took me to this person, and he affirmed my trans identity within 2 appointments, really the first appointment, and I think it was the 3rd appointment that he suggested I start testosterone.
Let's say I was a dictator of the world and I made a rule that says no transgender can transition until the age of 28. And then they have to pay for it with their own money. Now, what is the risk of that? What's the downside?
You'll have an increase in suicides before 28.
Okay. I knew you would answer that way, and this is a trap question. Do we have any evidence of that?
Yes, we do, because we know transitioning will decrease the rate of suicide.
Do we have, show me the evidence of that, of actual suicides? Actual suicides.
So you want me to show you the rate of people suiciding without transitioning versus suiciding after transitioning?
Right.
Okay.
Of actual, no, don't come back to me in a day and say thought of suicides or considered suicide or even suicide attempts. I'm talking about actual suicides. And Gabe, I'll be very honest with you. You're going to spend the next 2 days trying to find it, and you won't find it.
It seems like all of this is based on the fear that if you don't affirm a child's identity right away, they're going to be at a high risk of suicide.
We're living in an age where there's the whole do you want a dead daughter or a live son thing going on, right? And parents are being intimidated and coerced into if you don't affirm right away, your kid's going to commit suicide. Well, that's a really dangerous thing to tell people.
There's a real dereliction of duty and irresponsible behaviors that people have been misrepresenting the data on suicide.
All of the clinicians that are actually tracking current rates of self-harm and suicide will tell you, luckily, the suicide rate is quite low. And it's not a legitimate outcome. And that we don't know medicalizing reduces suicide.
I've actually done research on the world's largest youth gender clinic in London, known as the Tavistock, to investigate the actual number of deaths by suicide. Out of 15,000 patients over 10 years, they've had 4 suicides. Now, those are 4 terrible tragedies, of course. But as you can see, suicide, thankfully, is very, very rare. Now, the suicide rate for these patients is higher than the overall population, perhaps 5 or 6 times higher. But we can't conclude that this elevated risk is directly related to transgender identity, because many of these kids have other psychological conditions that we know increase the risk of suicide, like depression, eating disorders, and autism.
Okay, so I just did a little bit of cursory searching, and Doug, you do seem to be right for the most part.
I am right.
Okay, but let me. Okay, no.
I would say this is a very political issue.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
And because it's a political issue, would you be for having a panel of psychologists to determine if a kid is really transgender? But on this panel, you have to have far left, far right, mid-left, mid-right psychologists. In other words, you got to have some Trump voters who are psychologists. Would you be for that?
There's not many of them.
Not if it was the consensus of the field. I'm sorry, Sean. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's not. The problem is there's not many right psychologists.
Well, there is.
But even if there's less, though.
But you see my point, what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is the reason why people like me don't trust a psychologist who says a kid's transgender is because you mostly have far left-leaning psychologists making these assessments on a very politicized issue. So I'm going to actually speak on behalf of a lot of people in America too. They don't trust these psychologists. They don't trust them.
People who are writing the standards of care sitting on a panel saying it's okay to call CPS on parents who are not affirming. Our side is not doing anything to de-escalate either. So I want liberals to help us de-escalate this from culture war to conversation.